This audiobook is free, and has been read for Robot Voice Audio. Please visit www.robotvoiceaudio.com. The author grants permission to listen to, and share this audiobook, but only in its current complete format. All other rights remain the property of the author. The House of Donn, by Robert Walton Mackenzie. The first edition was published by the author on September 21, 2020. This book is dedicated to Irish Eddie. The House of Donn is a black comedy, which is loosely based on Agatha Christie's Tontine, The 10 Little Indians. In the weeks leading up to the Second World War, a bunch of impecunious toffs are invited by the mysterious Lord Lucy to stay at the House of Donn, on his North Atlantic island retreat. One by one, the guests are systematically murdered, in an increasingly fantastic and unlikely fashion. No one can make any sense of it. Our bet is, that you won't be able to either. The House of Donn. To me, to my house, you shall all come after your deaths. Chapter 1, Home. Good morning, master, said a voice somewhere behind my eyelids. Good morning, name, is that my tea? I replied groggily. Yes, master. I took the oolong from him, thank you'd, and slurped. It was mighty fine. So, I had made it to base 1. I sat up. May I say something, master? Simpered name. Shoot, I said, like I was watching match of the day. We will all miss you, master. I didn't properly know who the all were, but I knew that name would certainly have been in the first rank of their number. That's very kind of you, name, but it will only be for a week. Mr. Heap was very, began name, but I cut him off precipitously. Damn Heap, I said hotly. Not this again, name. You know that it's got nothing to do with bloody Heap. Do you want to spoil my holiday or something? Name protested that he didn't. Then shut up about Heap, will you? I told him. Heap, Mr. Heap, was a former colleague of mine, and by any metric a man best forgotten. Name, however, still insisted that the Heap was somehow quietly working in the background, in the furtherance of my best interests. To hear Name tell it, Heap's benevolence possibly extended as far as the whole of humanity, and frankly, I didn't have time for his conspiracy theories. Yes, I could see that the man was upset that I was going, but I'd already had quite enough of his moping about. So, I tried to change the subject. Today I'm planning to go uptown, where I'm hoping to hook up with a couple of gals, I said expansively. Name's eyebrow went up. I could tell that he didn't approve. Girls? Which girls, master? I didn't say girls. I said gals, I corrected him. Name's flat expression showed me that he was mystified, and I knew that on these occasions he didn't like to press, but rather, to wait for me to bestow further information upon him. If it makes it any easier for you, then let's call them, Gallon 1 and Gallon 2, shall we? I heard Name mutter something about, a lost weekend, and as he turned, and pretended to start faffing with my clothes, I could see that he was trying hard to suppress a smile. When I went downstairs, Green was waiting for me. Hello, Dr. Moriarty. You off today? Hello, Mr. Green, I replied brightly. Oh, Dr. Moriarty. I've got some of your things here ready for you, and also, I've got some things that just require your signature, here, and here, thank you. With the admin all tickety-boo, I walked down to the ground floor and out across the quadrangle into the foyer, where a man in uniform stepped forward to greet me and open the door. It was drizzling outside. Before I left, I stopped and turned, and then briefly looked back up at the dark tower where I had my home. My limousine was parked on the curbside waiting for me. I say my limousine, but it wasn't a limousine which I owned. It was more the sort of a limousine which I would have liked to have owned, or that I felt that I deserved to own. I make a point of the car ownership here because that's really how this fiasco all began. If I were capable of leaving other people's well alone, then there'd be nothing to tell here, and no story for you. Instead, we'd be sat in a daytime Soho bar, under strip lighting, and I'd be talking broken biscuits to you. However, I will freely admit to you that I brought the situation upon myself, by wishing myself into the limousine on that day. So, it all came about because of a whim. This is how it happened. As I stepped across the pavement, a chauffeur jack-in-a-boxed out before me, and wide opened the car door. Alarm bells rang immediately. The driver was much too young, much too fit, and much too arrogant to be just tooling around in a car making his living. He had the look of a beefy Rutger Hauer. "Mr. Smith," the lubber said, and beamed at me like a malicious showgirl. I can vaguely remember what daydreamed through my mind. It went something like, "Mr. Smith, hey? That's the name of the everyman surely. I mean, if I'm John Bull, then I can always be a Mr. Smith, can't I?" The bottom line was, that I really wanted to be riding into town in this fine car, and in short order, I'd convinced myself that the conveyance was a sort of public transport. So, I climbed aboard. I hopped into the back of the car and slithered across the seat. It was plenty roomy enough. You could have comfortably thrown a couple of sumo wrestlers in there with me. Meanwhile, the light streamed in around me like I was in a small cathedral, convincing me that I'd made the right decision, in stealing Smith's ride. I practically felt pious sitting there. Before closing the door, Rutger leaned into me and said, in a manner which had a good deal too much of the, "Oh what a good boy am I," about it, "We brought your case, as you requested, sir." After I had thanked him warmly, he slammed the door on me and then stomped around to the cockpit to fire her up. You could tell that the limo was in top order by the way that it just purred like a getaway car. As we set off, smoothing our way out from the curb and on into the traffic, I was pleased to see that we were heading directly toward the city. Now, I've been driven around by a number of people in my time. I will mention two, my former chauffeur, Mr. Shu, and the hairy Cossack Gonzalez. You may remember me telling you about them both on another occasion? Well, Rutger deserves a mention in their company. He drove like a complete maniac. It was as if we had warp drive, in central London. Still, you know me, I don't like to complain, so I just sat tight and tried to think about something else. I fastened upon the attaché case that I had requested, and which was now parked on the back seat with me. To be fair to myself, I did a good job of not actually touching the case for at least a couple of high-speed miles. After all, what business was it of mine? Right? However, when Rutger slammed the brakes on to narrowly avoid hitting a nanny with the pram, the bag slipped off the polished seat and bounced onto the floor. Unfortunately, I was too late to stop it spilling. It danced on one corner, and then the other, before springing wide open. So in the end, no fiddling around with the fancy combination locks had been required. I noticed that Smith was packing his own lunches, and I opened his tuck box and took out a sandwich, ham and tomato, while I looked at the gun. I was impressed. It was one of those fat guns that the real ballers use, and as I considered the prodigy, Smith's projected day popped up before me. In the morning, murder and mayhem, a picnic lunch, followed by more murder and mayhem in the afternoon. I already have a lot of experience with guns, and so I know all about them. But what I mainly know is that they're very dangerous, and that in general, you're best to avoid the people who use them. Still, unfazed, I took another route around in the case. There wasn't a great deal else to see, apart from a manila folder with the legend, Project Gwendolyn, written in black bold 50-point caps, and with top secret emblazoned over it in red, at a jaunty angle. Now, I'm no busybody. But I really love a secret, particularly when they're other people's. So, I flipped the file open on my knee and carefully peeled the silver foil from a Jacob's Club, the biscuit of choice. At first the document seemed like a slow burner. We were being introduced to some character named Charles Parker, who was apparently employed as a butler. Things then got a bit technical. Charlie likes this, Charlie does that, and then all Charlie's vital statistics listed in a table. To be honest, I wasn't happy with the way in which the character was being developed. It was all rather dull, and so I flipped to the last page in order to see if it eventually came to a point, and bingo. The last page was basically just a list of typed names and ink signatures, but what immediately grabbed my attention were the attendant figures. What I particularly liked about those figures was that most of them were nice and round, and were being chaperoned about by lots of commas. Now, I'm not an accountant, but it really looked like what we had on our hands here was a goddamned bonanza. Oh. Yes, I know what you're thinking. Obviously, at this point, it will already have occurred to many of you pikers that I had accidentally stumbled into some sort of funny business, and that said business evidently involved some pretty tasty people, Rutger, or the gun-toting picnicker Smith, for example. And you will be thinking to yourself, that the simple, honest thing to do, would be to wait for the car to stop at a set of traffic lights, and then hop out and run like Billia. While I can sympathize with this outlook somewhat, I now have to confess to you that I'm very much involved in the funny business for myself. In fact, funny is my business, and so my perspective on this quizzical turn of events was merely to consider that I might have chanced upon a potentially lucrative job opportunity. It's as I say, always look on the bright side. Consequently, I resolved to put off my Brannigan, and decided to continue tagging along with Rutger, until he'd worked out where he was actually going, which in the end turned out to be Clapham. We'd been at it for a half hour and were red-shifting along the A587, when without warning he swerved into a parking lot, and threw out the anchors. As my door flew open and I sagged out after it, I felt sick with the motion. The feet of the individual whose shoes I was now looking at, belonged to a bear of a man with a face like a Rottweiler. He was busy looking down at me like they delivered the wrong package. Fortunately, I've plenty of experience in dealing with this model, and so I knew how to operate it. "Reese, are you Reese? Where's Reese?" I yapped up at him like a terrier. There was a noise like a shot. It was only the steel door of a building slamming shut, and we both turned in sync to see Zipper-dee-Doo-Dah striding towards us, with his hand extended like a relay runner. Reese, or if you like, Mr. Reese Geyser, resembled a psychopathic car salesman. No amount of smiling and fawning would be enough to conceal that in his head, "I don't fucking believe this," was running on a loop, and that once this voice stopped talking to him, the pain would really begin. He was also thin-skinned almost to the point of being transparent, and I could see that he was finding it difficult to conceal his disappointment with me. Nevertheless, Reese managed to shoo me into his office, and after ostentatiously putting his feet up on his desk, was soon waving paperwork at me. "It says here that you're 6'4", not the other way round," he said, evidently not aware that a person has feelings. Reese probably wasn't aware of how much danger he was in at that precise moment. But the excitement soon passed, even if it was not to be soon forgotten. "I'm not responsible for your administrative cock-ups," I told him icily. "Well, we haven't got a lot of time. We've got to get you a load of clobber to take with you, so that you look like a butler. Now that we've actually seen you, that's probably going to take all morning." "Shit. What are you like as a butler? Have you ever done any work as a butler before?" Naturally, I was outraged by this suggestion, and reflexively I wanted to jump up and yodel at him, "Do not be so fucking stupid." However, Perhaps anticipating the part, I managed to advise him suavely that, "I've read my Wodehouse, and apparently all you have to do is act like a pompous ass. It'll be fine." Reese seemed about to debate whether or not it would be fine, and as debating things appeared to be his métier, I insisted that we press on. "Listen, Reese, you're just a go-between who's handling the travel arrangements, and frankly, my old son, I'd have much preferred to have dealt direct with Thomas Cook. So just get me the fucking uniforms, tell me where I have to go, and how you're going to get me there pronto, hey. If you're not accustomed to this style of negotiation, then my approach might seem like an awful lot of face. Alternatively, you may just be admiring the chutzpah. Yes, okay, I would have looked like a right Charlie, if, as I was delivering this barrage, Smith had managed to catch up with the action, and had been standing behind me in the office, and preparing to tear off my whiskers. But take it easy. Relax. I'd read the manila folder closely, whilst we'd been stuck in traffic on the Bromley Road, and I now had all 16 pages of Project Gwendolyn firmly fixed in the noodle, in detail. So, I knew what we were dealing with here, what the stakes were and what the time frames were. I also knew that even if Mr. Smith's apparition had been believed, it would also have been announcing that Smith had somehow blundered in a venture in which failure was not an option. That was never going to happen. By my calculations, should Smith or the Reese associates discover any wrinkle in the seamless operation which they were contracted under pains to deliver, then they would immediately fold in a bid to save their own hairy hides. It didn't surprise me that Reese was impressed by my peremptory rudeness. He even started to look happy. All right, where you're going, is an island off Ireland. We're going to fly you there later this afternoon, after we've got you all packed. There's a plane that we land on the Thames. A nice little boat ride out to it, and then you're away." As he spoke, Reese helped to fly me out with a series of hand gestures. "Smashing, does the island have a name?" "Yes." Reese moved a paper across his desk. "Leg, it's called Leg." "Never heard of it," I complained as if the shortcoming were entirely Reese's fault. At the same time, I nodded like I had heard of it, and that it was exactly what I had expected. Chapter 2, Ireland. By early evening club, Reese had packed me a suitcase of clothes designed to assist me in my disguise as a gentleman's gentleman, and then delivered me to a quayside on the Emerald Isle. I had already learnt that the village I had been flown to was called Leg, and that the island I was going to was called the Island of Leg, or simply Leg. Apparently, no one in Ireland seemed to have a problem with calling two adjacent geographical locations by the same name, or wonder why the Irish hadn't made any significant progress in just under 2,000 years. But I guess that's just how they roll. I didn't want for company on the pier. There was a crowd of 13 of us hanging around. They all seemed surprised to be part of a party. But they soon got busy with the nervous introductions, and discovering that, "Oh, you're a guest of Lord Lucy as well, how do you do?" I already knew who all the cast were, because Gwendolyn had provided me with their bios. So please allow me to do the introductions for you. The first cracker out of the box was Sir Bernard Nero. I start with him simply because you couldn't miss him. He was a wildebeest of a man who was dressed like a play school presenter, and was what you might call conspicuous by his presence. Aged 51, and an executive of Supermarine Aviation Works Limited, Vickers, Nero didn't look particularly happy to be there, but I suspected that he wouldn't have been happy to be anywhere, except perhaps at the dinner table. Monsieur Pierre Hercule was an egghead, both a scientist, and a bloke with a head shaped like an egg. He admitted to being a Frenchman, by virtue of his having been born in the Congo, and was presently stationed down in Buckinghamshire with the Bletchley Park freaks. I could see that Gwendolyn was struggling to put her finger on what it was exactly that Hercule did, and that eventually, she gave up the circumlocutions in favor of scientist, a slippery term if ever there was one. Still, I doubt whether Hercule himself properly knew what it was that he did. It always mystifies me that we should invite these foreigners to run our sensitive intelligence operations. I don't know how we ever expect to keep a secret, if we repeatedly blab everything we know to the damned French. Anyway. The frump in the baggy orange turtleneck sweater was Miss Thelma von Stein, a 33-year-old misfit. But we can mostly skip over her. She was one of those smart, but not quite smart enough nerdy girls, who always leave a ringing in your ear. The entry simply noted that she was an American who was related to Dr. Dinky von Stein. But what anyone would want with her it is difficult to say. So, she was probably best just forgotten about. I speculated that some of the party may have been invited because they were uniquely placed, or had a specialist function, or were in a position to exert pressure on a particular individual. You know, all the usual business. Next, the fitness freak who was busy sweating himself into his handkerchief was Mr. Brian Cannon. Although he was eclipsed by Nero, the pair of them together on the pier had me wondering about the strength of the piling. Cannon, 57, ran a dodgy security company in Winchester, and he had apparently undertaken to act as the security officer for the Jolly. Maybe because of this function, he was dressed in what appeared to be a combination of shell suit and guard's uniform. Whatever it purported to be, it was certainly a very avant-industrial fashion. Cannon's qualification to attend the meeting was entirely connected to his Masonic rank of Sovereign Grand Inspector General. Basically, he was the bandmaster. Robert Port Arlington Whimsy, the effete young aristocrat with the blow-away blonde hair, was another up-sleeve whisperer, but only of the order of the Grand Elect Knight Kadosh. The 25-year-old was a dilettante who didn't do much, and apparently, what he did rather badly. Still, he'd come over on the big boat and was old money. Unfortunately, I knew from the file that he was an attendee because the old money had now become short change, and all that remained of the family was their superior attitude. Even so, I wasn't sure why he'd been invited, or what he was actually doing for us. Mr. Brown Marlowe, the man of the people with the bad physiognomy, was a fixer for the National Union of Mine Workers. Fittingly enough, he looked as if he'd been hit in the face with a shovel. Although the distinction is subtle, it was noted that Marlowe was not so much a socialist, as a gangster. But his unpleasantly overbearing and menacing manner had now taken him as far as he was going, and he certainly didn't have the smarts to mix it with these toffs. Still, he had to be good for something surely. Indeed, it was only a matter of hours before I was forced into begging him to please put off hurting me for the time being, Mr. Marlowe, and maybe we could have a bit of a chat before that happens. The hottie was Lady Gertrude Penelope, aged 23. She was the second daughter of the Earl of Worplesdon. She was an heiress, which you'd be best advised to pronounce phonetically as airhead. You couldn't miss her, because she wouldn't let you. Absolutely rolling in it, and as dumb a posh bird as you're ever likely to meet. My guess was that she was invited because there's always some dope who will stand for it. Unfortunately, she never shut up, and I wouldn't have been surprised to learn that Lucy, whoever he was, had finally just gone, oh what the hell, if the silly bitch wants to come, then for Christ's sake just let her. At least she was something nice for us all to look at. Unlike Lady Jane, or Lady Amelia Jane of Marsham Wold, Madame was everyone's favorite lorgnette-waving grande dame, in whose company strong men quivered. I'm afraid that she had rather a reputation for playing a bit rough, and knocking people about. The conoscenti said of her, that it paid to know her, so that you could get out of the way when you saw her coming. But she also had big money, and her family was influential in newspapers, finance, and industry. She didn't have an age. The old boy with the black hat on was Judge Lawrence Larry Harry. The 70-year-old was tipped to be the next master of the rolls, but privately most of his professional colleagues would have preferred him to keep his opinions to himself. In a nutshell, he was a judge, but he also wanted to be jury and executioner. That didn't mean that he couldn't occasionally be persuaded to see reason, and I supposed that that was actually why he was with us today. The gloomy bird who already looked seasick was Dr. Roderick Stapleton Watson. The 44-year-old Watson was a medical doctor, and a dandy who was notorious for doing his own thing. Perhaps because of this, he'd had a season ticket at the General Medical Council at one time. However, they'd not been able to pick him off once he started doing unpleasant things with diseases for the Defense Science and Technology Laboratory at Portland Down. Finally, the two men standing close enough to each other to hold hands were Pat and Mike Cook, aged 31 and 33 respectively. They barely resembled each other in any single feature, so I couldn't see that they were actually brothers. Of course, while it is possible that colleagues may share a name, particularly a common one such as Cook, I suspected that old Gwen might have been conflating their last names with their profession. Perhaps, being merely handies, she did not think that they merited the luxury of a surname. As they both had faces like the map of Ireland, I had them down for a couple of Murphys. But I never did find out what Pat and Mike's story actually was. Chapter 3, Island. We had to wait for about 20 minutes anticipating our transport as it put around a headland. During that time a black bug in the distance transformed itself into a coracle which docked exactly on local time. Its skipper was plainly both a roughneck and a Fenian, and as he shanghaied us aboard he assured us that his being late wasn't a problem. Still, I was pleased to see that the boat was adequate for the company and the conditions, and so as we set sail out of the little bay and into the Atlantic proper, I was content to listen to our captain gabbling on about the history of our destination. Leg was the original Black Isle, an island of the dead onto which the early Irish monarchs were ferried to be interred. Apparently, this was a time at which the dun cow was still mooing, and Irish kings were selected by the amount of Guinness they could quaff, and the weirdness of their subsequent alcoholic ravings. Once sober, these fellows would frequently discover themselves to be the lord of 100 men, with the oversight of a fiefdom of 5 meadows, and a cowpat. The salty intimated that you could get a more academic account of the matter on the back of a tea towel, inscribed with the bleak legend of Leg, which they sold at the Leg gift shop, should you want to know more. As the mythos gave out we caught our first sight of Leg, a plug of serpentinite which poked out sheer from the frisky North Atlantic. There's no natural way to get onto the island. It's just a big black rock, Pat told us proudly. The only way on there is via the jetty. Fortunately, as we hove into view and tied up you could see that the jetty was a well-engineered pontoon arrangement, and that leaving the boat wasn't going to be hit and miss. As you know the sea's agenda is to cover everything in slime, and then just hope that you take a toss. Once we'd been disembarked and the boat had been put off for the return journey, Captain O'Blarneystone, not his real name by the way, waved to us and shouted out, "See you all after the weekend, folks." Becoming aware for the first time that they were effectively being marooned together on an island, at least for the next 3 days, the captives called back out to him, but, won't you be back here tomorrow?" "Sorry, no, not till Tuesday, possibly Wednesday. It's a bank holiday, so I'm out on the lash," the wild rover bragged, as he faded into the noise of surf and gulls. The party now had to climb up rather a lot of steps, but the effort proved to be worth it. The top of the outcrop was pretty much a plateau, and we were uplifted by our first sight of the dark house which stood on its pinnacle, with the sun setting behind it, and the sea swirling around below. The squad had fallen in two abreast as we made it onto the path which led up to the house, and I actually felt proud to be taking them up to such a pile. You could see this was legitimately a dream house, the house upon the hill, T.M. Barrett Holmes had been nowhere near this one. When we reached the door there was a plaque inscribed with, Donn's Place, which all seemed friendly enough. Looking around I spotted the door pull, which was a big old iron contraption. As I pulled it down I worried about making the roof of heaven collapse in. Ding dong. Avon calling. As the troop waited in a mute expectancy, Lady Jane took advantage of the lull to gank Nero, who was still reliving the horror of his climb up from sea level. "Why are you wearing that yellow shirt? It makes you look unnecessarily flamboyant." She smiled at him sweetly, before adding matter-of-factly, "You're not a homosexual, are you?" "No, madame, I am not," Nero panted. He clearly didn't have enough energy to be a homosexual. "Oh, so you're not in the closet then," she continued to press earnestly. "Neither am I in the closet, madame. Manifestly I would not fit in the closet. I would require a much bigger space than a closet to accommodate me. I hope that satisfies you." I decided to break the show up. "Don't worry. I have the key," I said, and gave the gang my, "just you wait till I get you inside" smile. As we tumbled into the big house the group naturally seemed to ooze into the drawing room and come to rest around a massive circular table, which was one of the features in there. I was immediately right at home, and I could see that other people were also impressed. It was dead posh all right. Most homes have furniture. This place had furnishings. It also had that high-quality lived-in vibe happening. The only thing that spoiled my initial impression of the place was a bag of potatoes that some serf had left on the table. I found this really irksome. Of course the Irish love a potato, and why not? The potato is such a versatile vegetable, but if you ask me, please, not at a time like this. Once we'd caught our breath, people started asking, "So, where is everyone?" As the fancy dress was now equivalent to my surroundings, I stepped forward, and explained that I would endeavor to find out. After a pantomime of leaving the room and re-entering I made my announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, a telegram has arrived for me with your luggage, and unfortunately I have to let you know that Lord Lucy's party has been delayed." It was pure Gwendolen, and was met with a collective sigh. But I just ignored the commentary. "Perhaps if you would allow me to show you to your rooms, and then a little later I may be able to give you some extra information." "Oh, all right, what the hell," someone at my sleeve assented. Having taken a look at their rooms and made sure that they were happy with the billing, they all trickled back downstairs and congregated in the drawing room. Evidently, they were now all of a mind to address the next item on the agenda, namely, what had become of their host, and where the hell was the ungracious bastard. After this, and other dark imprecations had been uttered, they collectively turned their ire upon the hired help. "I have phoned Lord Lucy's secretary and unfortunately he's been arrested in France. I've been assured that his lordship is doing everything he can to get here as soon as possible, and his staff have told me to tell you that he fully expects to see you shortly." The spokesman for the opposition was Harry. "That's all well and good. But no one I have spoken to in London seems to know Lucy, or even to have heard of him, as far as I can tell. Who the hell is he exactly?" he grumbled at me. "Well," I began, spinning the unctuous knob up to 10, and starting to oil, "naturally, Lord Lucy is a retiring figure. The contingencies of his work as a negotiator at the highest level, demand that his public profile necessarily should remain rather vague. He has perforce, to be a very private." Yes, but why does nobody seem to know him, at all?" said Harry peevishly. "Well, sir, that may possibly be, because many people do not altogether realize that his lordship's real name is unknown." Canned laughter. "You mean, that you don't actually know what his bloody name is?" Harry guffawed incredulously. No sir. I mean that his full name is Lord Lucian Unknown, and that it's only Lord Lucy to his friends. This news appeared to strike Harry as rather fishy. He looked at me as if I'd just slapped him with a halibut. I see, he said, but musing as if he really didn't. Do me a favor, Parker, go into the library, and see if they've got a Debrets in there, will you? We'll have it in here straight away, thanks. It turned out that Lucy's entry in the peerage was faultless, and could not be gainsaid. Accordingly, in spite of all their earlier griping, the guests were impressed by what they'd read, and this transformed itself into a new sense of bonhomie towards that splendid fellow, our host, and so for the time being at least, the bitching was over. Harry was now affability itself. I, meanwhile, was butlering away like the best of them. So Parker, how long have you been with Lord Lucy? It's possibly just going on 11 years now, sir. Oh, 11 years. That long. And what is he really like, hey? I think that I would describe him as urbane, sir, I said, making a song and dance of choosing my word carefully. But now that you all seem a little happier with his bona fides, I would prefer for you to wait and talk directly with his lordship. I am keenly aware of his lordship's desire for discretion, and I am anxious not to say anything to you which may unwittingly betray any of his confidences. I think that Gwendolen said it best, when she said, "You say nothing, got that?" As people dressed and they were waiting with cocktails to go in to dinner, Lady Penelope made her entrance and immediately made herself the center of attention. Look. I've found something in the bottom of a drawer, in my room, under the towels. It says here, that it's a picture of Lord Lucy. Hey Parker, old man, said Harry, beckoning to me, is this Lucy? I confirmed it, yes indeed sir. He was winning in a polo match in Argentina. He looks exactly like what I thought he would do, gushed Lady Penelope. Look how high he sits. Here, let me see, ordered Lady Jane, bustling in, and then stopping to stare abstractedly. He looks a bit sharp if you ask me, grizzled Marlowe, but nobody had. After dinner, the team traipsed back into the drawing room, which had become the de facto place to socialize. As they were milling around in there, the main topic of conversation was how, against all expectations, Pat and Mike had really got their shit together with the comestibles. People were moving in and out and the mood was congenial, when Lady Penelope came downstairs wearing a t-shirt over her dinner dress. Look what I've found. I found it hanging in my wardrobe, she announced. The shirt was emerald green. It had a large potato printed on the front, and the number 2 printed on the rear, like a footy top. People laughed and several of them commented that they had found a similar garment in their rooms, but with a different number on the back. Yes, and do you have a plaque on your wall with the old one potato verse? Lady Penelope trilled. Excuse me, madame. But what is this one potato? Frenchie squeaked, as his eyebrows trailed him off into a quizzical expression. Oh, you know, the children's game. You are not it, she said, emphasizing the final phrase with staccato, and repeatedly tapping his arm. But Hercule dissented, but no, madame. This was Lady Penelope's cue to begin a descent into trivia. It was a party, I suppose. Lady Penelope herded a group together into a loose circle and made them hold their fists out before them. Next, she bounced her fist over theirs as she sang, announced, 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, 4. 5 potato, 6 potato, 7 potato, more. You are not it, she finished with gusto. She landed on Harry with her final word, fist, and he was made to remove his hand and put it behind his back, and so the day wore on. When she had finished with the rigmarole, only Nero remained with a fist out, and Lady Penelope pronounced him to be the winner. "There you go. See Hercule. Nero is it?" "He is it," she announced, again with the staccato business. They all seemed to think that it was hilarious. Me, not so much. Of itself, the appearance of the green shirts and rhymes was inconsequential. It could simply have been a hospitality calculated to break the ice. However, to my mind, it raised a red flag. If I may be permitted to make a comment, so far the operation, and my flawless management of it, had been peachy. But the T-shirts were clearly something that had been planned, and yet had not been mentioned in Gwendolen. So I didn't like it. Still, press on, hey? Once I could see that they were all assembled, I made an announcement, as per the directions. I called them to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, a moment please. When I spoke to Lord Lucy before dinner, he asked me to perform a small duty. I have here a recording which in his absence he has asked me to play for you, and with your permission, I would like to do so now. To anticipate your inquiries, I do not know anything about the record. Merely, that I have been instructed that I should play it to you." The party stood to attention slightly formally, as if they were expecting me to spark up the national anthem, or some such. The record player that I had found was an old winder, so we began with what sounded like a large noisy pan of bacon frying, but the friction soon cleared, and the music began to scratch itself out. It turned out to be a song, Dave Brubeck's Take 5. Naturally, nobody was enjoying themselves much, but nevertheless they listened politely to the end, and once the ordeal was over, they were bemused. Was this a joke? Did Lucy like jazz or something? Was he a jazz buff? It was all very odd indeed. I merely thanked them for their attention, and after that, we all went to bed. Chapter 4, Murder. Early the next morning I was out in the garden gathering buds for the indoor displays, when the second red flag went up, and Gwendolen sailed completely off the piste. I discovered a dead body. "So now you can go, uh-oh." It was Nero. His corpse was unpleasantly splattered across the geranium terrace. A messy business. Naturally, I cheesed the flower picking and went back into the house to raise the alarm, and soon the household's complement were all al fresco. As you know, I am always at pains to show respect. But to some of you my description of the death scene here may seem a little frivolous. However, I can only in good faith tell you what the crime looked like, and I only do so in order that you can form your own impression. Nero was as flat as a pancake. He had been ground into dust. The only part of him that wasn't squashed was his head, which is how we could tell that he was face up. I have to say that he looked a bit bewildered to me. The spooky thing was that his final condition couldn't have been a result of how he was killed, but only after a considerable post-mortem effort. I'm not an especially fussy man, I mean murder somebody by all means, but for heaven's sake don't start faffing around with their corpses. That's just plain creepy. Well anyway, the difficulty that we all had was knowing what construction to place on what we were looking at. You see, the question wasn't simply who, or how, but mostly, why in such a bizarre manner. The problem as I saw it was, that you would have probably needed a gang of laborers to achieve the effect. I mean, it looked like the sort of enterprise that you might need to get macadam involved in. In a word, it looked industrial. So naturally, we wondered how all this had gone on right under our noses. "Is there any machinery on the island?" asked Hercule. "I believe that there's a rotary hoe, sir," I replied. This intelligence was not really helpful, because it only gave the sleuths the dilemma of trying to figure out if a rotary hoe were capable of producing such an outcome, without them actually knowing what a rotary hoe was, or actually did. The problems compounded as a new issue arose: what to do with the stiff. I mean, you can't just leave a loose head lolling around on the lawn, can you? Go and get a clothes basket, will you, Parker? We can toss the head into that for the time being, Harry directed. When I returned, they had folded up the trampoline and moved it into the gazebo. So we neatly stretched the trampoline cover over the exhibit, and I got an axe and made some pegs, which I used to hold the tarp down. That would have to be the best we could do until the cops arrived. The idea of the boys in blue arriving did not entirely make me jocund, because I knew that once they'd worked out who I was, they'd immediately start to regard me with their customary disdain. The very least that I'd be getting was some hot breath on my ear. The team eventually settled upon placing the basket oracle under the stairs, down amongst the wines and spirits, where they felt that it would be coolest. Obviously not ideal, but given the circumstances. With Nero dead, and Gwendolen gone fut, I wondered if I should tell the party that I was an imposter, describe to them how I had got there, and indeed let them know that Lucy wasn't ever coming. This decision required careful planning, so I went and had a sit-down. I can always think better when I'm sat. Once I got myself comfy, I blew out my cheeks and pulled them back in again, then I blew out my cheeks and pulled them back in again. Sometimes this process can go on for as long as 5 minutes, until I get everything clear. Then I tidied up, flushed the toilet and washed my hands. I had made my decision. I had decided to try and maintain an advantage by not telling the party exactly who I was, for the time being. Unfortunately, this meant that I would have to continue the charade of my being a butler, and I really hated having to play the rube. When I got back into the social vortex of the drawing room, the company was assembled around a big table, and browsing on some chips. Hercule was busy telling them that in all likelihood the case would never be solved. He compared the crime to the Marie Celeste, and said that in his opinion it was best forgotten, or just regarded as one of those things. While I could see that the sudden death had shaken the party, they were also more or less concluding that the episode had nothing to do with them personally, and so they shouldn't let it spoil their weekend away. Consequently, even as Hercule was making his points, people had already started to discuss other topics. Once they had satisfied themselves of the party line, they broke it up and started to drift off to their rooms and elsewhere. That was a nuisance for me, because I was the idiot who was now expected to run upstairs and downstairs after them. I'd been back and forth on this itinerary for a couple of hours, when I got the bell to go up and see Lady Jane. I dutifully trotted up to see what the old bag wanted. I knocked and came. When I got in there before her, she fixed me with her eye. It was like being disemboweled by the way. Eventually, she said, "So tell me, when you see a beautiful woman, do you ever make the mistake of not recognizing that she's just another dumb bitch?" I stared at the lady, somewhat taken aback, and then I cleared my throat. "Well, madame, I would go as far as to say, that I always make that mistake, every time." "Good, so you may possibly do. I rang for you because, well, I wanted to ask you how we stand." "Excuse me, madame," I was nonplussed. "Of course, what I mean is, by the way, what is your name?" "My name is Parker, madame." "Yes, it's Parker. I did know. I like you, Parker, you're a consummate liar. I can already tell that." "Thank you, madame." "Well, Parker, what I wanted to ask you is, are you a man? I mean, you actually are a man, you're not a bit latent, are you?" She asked me this as if she were frustrated at not being able to frame her question quite correctly. "Oh no, madame, nothing of that sort. But since you have been kind enough to ask, I'm very much a ladies' man. I have had 3 wives, I said with aplomb. "I see, well, Parker, I am a lady," she beamed up at me, rocking her head to one side, and simpering at me in what I guess she supposed to be a coquettish manner. I confess that this frightened me more than a little. "Indeed, madame," I managed to gulp at her. "And," she said, her expression adding, "we're waiting." "Well, madame. I hesitate to speak, but I fear that my taste in women runs to something rather less mature." I said the last two words as if I was picking them extremely carefully. "What, you like children?" she gasped at me, horrified. "Certainly not, madame. My preference is for what I would describe as a young woman. I married each of my 3 wives when they were aged 19, for example." She seemed to weigh this, and then she surprised me by asking, "What were they like, your wives?" "Well, there was the blonde, and then a brunette, and finally I tried a redhead. They were all very nice." "So why did they leave you?" "On each occasion, the judge made the excuse of extreme mental cruelty." Lady Jane looked up at me abruptly. "I can't believe that of you, Parker." "No, indeed not, madame. However, I do confess to being a trifle difficult to live with, on occasions. Such as when the moon is full." "What was the redhead like?" "I bet that she was a right handful. In my experience redheads are all crackers." "In your description of her, it is exactly as if you knew her, madame." Then, she came out of left field at me, "Did you ever hit her?" "Not unless the situation particularly called for it, madame," I replied suavely, and I could immediately tell that I'd gone up in her estimation. "You know, Parker, the young people of today seem to have forgotten all about the psychiatric benefits of the old straightforward treatments, such as cold baths, brisk walks, and the flat of the hand. My husband often used to put it to me," she said matter-of-factly, before adding much more wistfully, "Oh, of course. I'd have a good yell, and then go and have a couple of hours in bed feeling sorry for myself, but later, it was just as if the sun had popped up over the horizon. I'd really feel myself to be knocked into shape. Women don't like to be given their own way all the time, you know, and a bit of what's what always did me a power of good." She paused briefly in reverie, and then said dismissively, "Okay, Parker. You can go now." "Thank you, madame," I chirruped. "But before you do go, just give me one small kiss, will you, Parker?" Saying so, she suddenly reared up at me like something escaping from the crypt. "I'm sorry, madame, but I fear that I must decline your request," I stammered, falling back. "Oh, all right then, damn you," she snapped, "just get out of here." As I sailed from the room, she spoke to my back with the voice of command. "But Parker, if a ship sinks and a battalion of sailors is washed ashore half dead, and look like they might need my assistance, then come and get me, will you?" "Very good, madame." A short time later, I was again summoned by Lady Jane, and I went to her room in trepidation, afraid that she intended to give me another razzing. But once I'd knocked and gone in, I discovered that she had other things on her mind. "Oh, there you are. Go and see Watson and get him to give me a little something, will you please, Parker?" "A little something, madame?" I inquired. "Yes, the doctor will know, he's a doctor," she informed me in faultless female. I smiled at her, as if to say, "Your will is my command," and scooted off to find the quack. He was in his lair. I knocked and went. As I entered, the doctor was busy at a table with some pharmacy, and I waited until he gave me his attention. He glanced up at me and sniffed. Lady Jane has asked me to ask you if you could provide her with something. She says that she's a little low," I said. "No wonder looking like that," he said scornfully. "What's the woman's problem? Is she depressed? Has she gone existential on us, or is she just a bit fed up with herself? Tell her that's life, and to just get on with it, will you? She informs me that she is feeling rather disappointed, because the island has not offered her an opportunity of a romantic adventure. The doctor scoffed. Well, she can't go blaming the bloody geography for that. No single island could guarantee her that. You'd need an archipelago at least. Tell her, what she needs to do is have a good long look in the mirror and have a good hard think. Think, sir. He sat up. So, she thought that she was coming on a saga holiday, did she? He chuckled. I gather that Lord Lucy rather gave her to understand that there would be a number of unspoken for elderly bachelors attending the meeting, for her to hunt down, sir. I see, she spoke to Lucy, did she? The doctor was quick to pick up on the Lucy motif. Yes, sir, over the phone, I believe. What did he have to say to her then? Well, sir, I said cautiously. Since we arrived, I have been speaking with the various guests in order to try and establish what his lordship's particular interest is in each of them. Go on, said the doctor. Well, to speak plainly, it appears that a number of them are simply impecunious, and are looking to support Lord Lucy in exchange for a financial gain. But Lady Jane's case is different. She doesn't need the money, she's got squabs of it, or perhaps I should say that she is presently well disposed. However, my impression of the lady's circumstance is, well, that she's an elderly nymphomaniac who desperately needs a man, and possibly not just the one, sir, and that Lord Lucy has undertaken to act for her as a... I hesitated in order to choose my word judiciously, and this allowed the doctor to interject, gigolo. Oh no, sir. I would consider that enterprise to be beyond even Lord Lucy's capacity. I was casting him more in the role of a panderer, sir. I see, so he's running a sort of high-class dating agency, is he? The doctor started chuckling again, and then smirked at me. Well, I'm glad at least that someone appears to have a handle on the situation, Parker. Tell me, as you're the only one that has met the man, and the rest of us have only had contact with him via the phone or through third parties, what do you think that he has dragged us all over here for? I trust that this is in confidence, sir, I replied. His look was conspiratorial, and so I continued, my appraisal of the situation is, that the meeting was arranged so that Lord Lucy should be in a position to coordinate the betrayal of various interests, ahead of the impending war. You think that's definitely on, do you? Unfortunately, yes, there seems to be no doubt about that, sir. I paused before continuing. Still, his lordship's idea about the war appears to be that there will be money to be made, and advantage to be sought, provided that you aren't too parochial or squeamish about the consequences. Particularly when those consequences are for other people. Yes, that's exactly how it struck me. Treason, some people might call it, but we don't want to start getting finicky, do we? What we must remember is that what we are doing here is all being done for a much higher cause, our own selfish best interests. Watson grinned at me wolfishly. Are you a part of his little cabal, Parker? In my own small way, I like to think so, yes, sir. Good, so we're all in it for our own miserable selves, hey? I stood to attention. Yes, sir, very much so, sir. The doctor now became businesslike, and opening his black medical bag he took out a packet. Here, give her this should sort her out. If she asks, just tell her it's a bit of toot. He ran the powder out onto the tray that I was holding. Then he looked up at me, do you want some? I hesitated, and Watson continued, no, I suppose not. Don't worry, it's not addictive, unless you take it all the time, and then of course, it's highly addictive. The doctor closed his bag and put it on the floor. It's up to you, of course. It does you no real harm. I take it all the time. I suppose that's why one minute I seem morose and withdrawn, and the next you just can't seem to shut me up. It gives you a sort of mania, you see. He grinned at me as if having a sort of mania was a good thing. Yes, thank you, doctor, I said, and shoved off. Knock knock. Come in. I re-entered Lady Jane's room, and was surprised to find Whimsy and Hercule stood there looking into the closet. "Hello, Parker," Whimsy said conversationally, but without looking at me. He continued to Hercule, "You know that's a particularly unpleasant thing to do with knitting needles." "Yes, completely disgusting, and needlessly biological, I should say, obviously the work of a pervert," countered Hercule. "What do you suppose those bruises were caused by?" Whimsy asked. "I really don't know," replied Hercule dumbly. I had edged my way further into the room, in order to find out what they were rabbiting on about. I immediately wished that I hadn't. Lady Jane was stretched out in the closet. She was dead. She was also naked, and looked like Tutankhamun's recently disinterred older sister. It was the stuff dreams are made of. I confess that I made a bit of a faux pas at this point. Nothing too serious, still in my game, you have to be ahead of the game. I guess that I was still in shock at the sight of the hag. The handle of the murder weapon, or at least one of them, was poking out from underneath the bed, and I bent down and withdrew it. It was a staff with a flat head, braided into the shape of a club such as you get in a deck of cards. The staff looked rather Masonic, and was the sort of thing that you might have expected Gandalf to be tooling around with, but in reality, it was only a device used for cleaning carpets, and murdering old women. The old bat had taken a severe beating all right. "I think that it might have been this," I announced like a chump. The two gentlemen turned toward me in unison. "What have you got there, Parker?" demanded Whimsy. "I fear that it is the murder weapon, sir." "No. I meant on the tray." "Ah, that is a medication for Lady Jane." Cannon chose that moment to come bounding in, and interrupted my explanations. He was sweating profusely and waving a gun around. I noticed that his brown uniform was mottled with damp spots. "I've just heard." "What happened?" he demanded breathlessly. "The old madame has been murdered." "It is a heinous crime, an infamy, n'est-ce pas?" prattled Hercule. "So, what have you learned about it so far?" Cannon demanded suspiciously. "Parker here has the murder weapon and some Class A drugs," said Whimsy helpfully. I was holding the carpet beater, and a tray full of cocaine. Cannon turned on me. "So," he long-sewed, "you've caught the bounder, have you?" The dirty look that he gave me said, "I'm a pro C, and I damned well knew it was you all along." "If you'll forgive me, sir. Dr. Watson has expressly prescribed this medication, and I am merely holding this carpet beater after I retrieved it from where it lay under the bed, in response to a request from these two gentlemen." Cannon's expression did not alter, but by some art, his face now said, "Yeah, says you." Suddenly he said, "Tell me, Parker, why do you always wear those white gloves?" He spoke as if this were going to be a difficult question for me to answer. "Because I prefer them to the black ones, sir. They're much nattier in my opinion." "I'm not talking about the damned color, man. I'm talking about why you've always got those gloves on. There's a rumor going around that you've got a disfigured hand. Is that true?" "It really is only a slight problem, sir," I said flatly. "Well, you can understand the position here. I was supposed to take charge of the security for this function. So I'd now like to see your hand. Please come around here, and take off your glove." I always like to be helpful, and so I did as I was requested. "But, there's nothing wrong with your hand," the detective announced triumphantly to Whimsy and Hercule, with an air of, "Now we're really getting somewhere," about him. "No, sir, not on this hand, but on the left hand," I advised him. Cannon looked at me venomously, and I took this to mean, "Get the other bloody glove off pronto." He studied my palm a bit, before giving me his prognosis. I thought that you said that it was disfigured. It just looks like, well, some eczema, that's all." "Indeed, sir. I am sorry to have misled you," I told him coldly. He'd evidently been expecting something festering, along the lines of the stigmata. "However, it's really not the appearance of a hand which you would be pleased to see, for example, whilst busy helping to ladle out the croquet potatoes." The panel instantly recognized reason when they heard it, and the observation torpedoed Cannon's inquiry into embarrassment. "Game, set and match, I should say." "May I put the gloves back on, sir?" I said, in order to rub it in. I was permitted to, and then there was a difficult silence which Whimsy broke by saying to me, "Okay then, drag her out of there, and get her knickers back on, will you? We'll let the doctor look at her first, and then we'll help you put her downstairs with the other chappie." I started. It was an unpleasant prospect, but given my standing in the hierarchy, I should not have been surprised that I'd been pushed to the front of the queue for the filthy job. "What's wrong with you, man? You're the one with the gloves on," said Whimsy stiffly. I wanted to tell the gentleman that putting knickers back on wasn't a part of my job description. That in fact, that was women's work. However, I consoled myself with the observation that Whimsy would be murdered pretty soon, anyway. And as it turned out, I was dead right. By mutual consent, the party had again all gathered in the drawing room, and were standing around eating herb potato wedges. The discussion of the situation was still casual, but they were now regarding each other with a renewed interest and suspicion. There was a good deal of eye tennis going on, and naturally, people were behaving much more warily. The first murder had been of interest as a talking point, but the second murder had really put it up them vertically. So they'd all got the willies now. Lady Penelope stormed in and interrupted the conversation. "The phone has been cut off," she demanded of me. Gwendolen had warned me that this would happen, and so I remained composed. "Don't panic, milady. It's simply a fault on the line," I said serenely. Lady Penelope looked at me astonished. I might have been a leprechaun. But I had my excuse ready for her. "You see, milady, the phone often goes down, depending upon how the waves are moving the wire on the seabed. I'm afraid that you might have to wait for the tide to come back in before you can get through." A fine tale, but you will appreciate the heavenward gestures and hand-wringing that went on, at the news that they were now completely cut off. When Whimsy failed to come down for dinner that evening, I was sent up to investigate. Having knocked and got no reply, I went in and found the young aristocrat propped up on the bed, as dead as a door. "I told you so. It was murder, naturally. I don't know what else you'd expect around here. It was like Corpse Central." The young squire had several pillows propped up behind him, and was wearing a flash smoking jacket. In death, his complexion looked like badly mixed concrete, and his color had been curdled to a curious shade of off-white green. He was sat in a pool of blood. On the coverlet next to him lay an open box of chocolates, half eaten. A syringe had been driven directly into his eye. I went and fetched the doctor immediately. When Watson saw the body, he gave a harumph, and set about examining it. To be fair, he did so in an apparently thorough manner. He really snapped to, and actually looked as if he knew what he was doing. In the face of this professionalism, I was relegated to the status of just loitering around, and asking stupid questions. "Was it poison, doctor?" I asked him lamely. The doctor didn't appear to mind the interruptions, and in fact, having someone to talk to seemed to help him to get his story straight. "Well, the syringe in his eye is full of strychnine, but that didn't kill him, not enough time for that. He'd also been eating these chocolates, which, as you can see from the ones I pared open, are full of little white pellets, granules of arsenic. But the arsenic didn't kill him, at least I don't think so, there's not a sufficient quantity. I tried to make my face say, "So what the hell did kill him then, Doc?" "These are what killed him," said Watson, shaking a small white medicine box at me. I now tried to make my face say, "So what exactly are those then, Doc?" "They're suppositories, filled with," he made me wait for it, "potassium cyanide." The doctor appeared pleased, delighted even. He told me, "Yeah, try popping one of those babies up there, and see where it takes you." I must say that I didn't particularly care for the doctor's bedside manner. It was too showy for my taste. But I wanted the facts, which you'll understand in the current circumstances might just help to keep me alive. "But what sort of condition might Whimsy be using a suppository for?" I inquired. The doctor looked surprised by the question. "Condition? Oh, I don't know. He was a party guy. He was probably just using them for a bit of fun. You know how much the upper classes love sticking things up their arses." I didn't, but I was learning. When I returned to the drawing room, I had the sad responsibility to announce Whimsy's death. People were appalled at yet another death. But I couldn't help but notice that the aspect of the tragedy which seemed to upset people the most, was that somebody had been tampering with the quality street. The discussion of this aspect of the murder was framed in such a way as to indicate that this sort of behavior was completely beyond the pale. Just not on. A decision was made to move the corpse downstairs before dinner, and eventually the whole gang tagged along to gawk at Whimsy's body and kibbutz. "How is it going, Watson?" said Harry, and Watson shrugged. There was nothing for them to see apart from a dead bloke sat in bed, and they'd had all the relevant details. So what more did they want? By the time that the body had been moved and the task force had gathered in the drawing room, it was past dinner time and the gong had yet to sound. There were some nibbles on the table, a basket of croquet potatoes, so Pat and Mike were keeping up with that much at least. But Harry sent me to find out what the hell was happening with dinner. When I returned a short time later and began bending the doctor's ear, nobody was being taken in. They all immediately realized that tea that evening was going to be a cold collation. The doctor and I tried to play it cool and slide out without a fuss, but as we left the drawing room it was at the head of a conga line. I took them downstairs to the servants' quarters, which, although a little gloomy due to them being beneath ground level, were also roomy and surprisingly well maintained, the servants for heaven's sake. I led them into Pat and Mike's room and let them survey the carnage. Pat and Mike were sat up in bed like Morecambe and Wise. They were dressed identically in their potato t-shirts, center half and inside right respectively, with white underpants and black socks. They had both had the bejesus beaten out of them. I have never seen the like of it. They were black and blue. The extent of the beating that they had taken was really quite remarkable. The other notable feature of the scene was that the room was entirely full of umbrellas. They were everywhere, 100 of them at least. The brollies were of all colors and designs, and had all been opened. It was a strange business. I was totally baffled. I suppose that a mind trained by years of sitting on the bench had enabled Harry to immediately weigh up a situation and see what was important in it. Having done so, he turned to me, and said, "Can you cook?" Once I'd put the two boys with the rest of the collection under the stairs, I returned to the drawing room and found everyone in there. "Oh my God, potato salad, yummy. I just love potato salad," gulped Lady Penelope. But the rest of the party couldn't find it within themselves to match her girly enthusiasm. Suddenly Harry demanded, "Who put those there?" indicating to the table. "What do you mean?" gobbled Penelope through another big mouthful. "If the cooks are both dead, who put these plates here?" said Harry, exasperated with her lack of little grey cells. "Did any of you put them out?" he barked. But nobody had. There was a silence while we all thought about this, and then Marlowe spoke out excitedly, "Yes, Harry, that's what has been bothering me." He snapped his fingers. "Every time that there's a death and we come back in here, there always appears to be another potato dish on the table." There was now a feverish look on Marlowe's face. After Nero died there was a plate of. As he paused to think, Watson butt in, chips, after Lady Jane, potato wedges, after Whimsy, croquet potatoes, and now after Pat and Mike, 2 dishes, mashed potato and potato salad. Lady Penelope stared wide-eyed, and open-mouthed. "That's not a good look when you're eating a potato salad, by the way." Then she swallowed hard and said, "What does it mean?" "It doesn't mean anything, it's insanity," shouted Harry, "it's the work of a madman." "I suppose that it could mean that these deaths are being sponsored by the Potato Marketing Board," said Hercule sotto voce. "I don't really think that the crafty foreigner was being serious, just dumb, but I must say that his explanation was as likely as any other." "Well, sod this for a game of soldiers." "I'm going to bed," said Harry angrily. "Yes. I'm coming with you," said Marlowe, although that wasn't what he meant exactly. The next morning, I'd risen early, and gone to town with breakfast, which was basically a dead barnyard on a plate. Once the rest of them had trickled down and fallen in, the register was called, and we discovered that Marlowe was absent. For my money, this was not a big loss, but nevertheless, I was sent by Harry to find the Lucan. That was easier said than done, but I eventually found him fooling around with the koi carp in the ornamental pond. The reason for my earlier difficulty in locating him was that Marlowe was staring out at me from under the water. He looked as if he'd been there for some time. So, he was either extremely good at holding his breath, or dead. Dead was my bet. I returned to the drawing room and prepared to make yet another gloomy announcement. As I was doing so, it occurred to me that I was rapidly being turned into the prophet of doom. "I am sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but I am afraid that I have discovered the body of Mr. Marlowe. He has been drowned in the ornamental pond." Privately, I wanted to add, "Marlowe sleeps with the fishes," but I didn't want to risk sounding too blasé in front of the clients. You could see that they were all shaken by the news, but the aspect of it by which they were most saddened, was what this actually meant for them personally. Faces looked grim. Still, it was a beautiful sunny day, and on reflection, not really the sort of day upon which you'd expect to find yourself marked out for death. Nevertheless, in the face of this terror, the team all resolutely traipsed out into the sunshine behind me. I marched them out beyond the tennis courts where we gathered beside the pond. By now there were so few of us left that it was possible to iterate their number: Harry, Hercule, Cannon, Watson, Penelope, and me, Parker. The group spent some time gingerly leaning over and staring myopically into the depths, as if they couldn't quite make out, or believe, what it was that they were looking at. Once they were all satisfied, Harry demanded, "Okay, fish him out of there." He was talking to me, because obviously, I was always going to be the one going in for a dip. I waded in, and as I got close to the body I made another startling discovery. "The body is enclosed in ice," I said, addressing my observation toward old Harry. The judge rolled his eyes in a gesture of annoyance at the situation, as if somehow, this was the final straw. Clearly, I wasn't going to be able to deal with the situation on my own, and so Cannon and the Frenchman were eventually forced into the pool, to have a splash around with me. It took some manhandling to get the prize out, because the ice was both heavy and slippery, but eventually, we managed to slide the block out onto the lawn. Phew. At first, it wasn't clear to us how Marlowe had died. Initially, I would have said that it was a toss-up between drowning and freezing. But once we'd dragged the icicle out of the water, we could see several things of interest. For example, Marlowe had an ice pick buried in his skull, and there was a salmon frozen in the ice with him. There was another point which struck me, but which nobody else articulated, so they may all have missed it. You know how it is when you pop an ice cube out of a tray, the ice keeps the shape of the tray. Well, in this case, it was noticeable that the ice had the slanting shape of a coffin. Imagine this setup: take a coffin, fill it with water, add a corpse and a fish, and then deep freeze it. That it would have taken an industrial freezer to complete such a job, is one issue for you to think about. However, if you've ever made cocktails, then you will know how ice sticks. So you will also know what a pain it would be to tap the finished article out of the coffin. I speculated about the coffin having to be dismantled in the process. But perhaps I was getting off the main point, which was that however it had been done, a block of ice, with a corpse and a fish floating in it, had been deep frozen, and then plonked into the pond. Of course the question was, why? What was the significance? Well, your guess is as good as mine. We'll leave him out here for the time being. Once he's thawed we can take the body downstairs, Harry told me matter-of-factly. By the time that we'd got back into the drawing room, the new potatoes were on the table. Unfortunately, the sight of the dish seemed to raise people's temperatures, and pretty soon there was a proper melee going on. I was happy to just hover in the background and listen to the accusations flying to and fro. It was actually pretty amusing. At one point, regarding the sudden appearance of the potato dishes, Harry had told them, "The forks. I don't give a fuck about the forks, people are dying here." But, perhaps inevitably, they eventually turned their attention to me. This was always on the cards. It was Cannon who started the onslaught. "You know, I've always felt that there's something fishy about this fellow, this butler," he sneered. "Me, sir," I cried, and pulled a hurt face. "Yes, you, Parker. For some reason, you're always the last to see a person, and the first to find the body. It's always you." "Perhaps that is because of the nature of my duties, sir. I am required to move around a lot, and speak with various people." "That is true, but equally, it could also be true because you're the one who is actually bumping them off, hey?" "Yes, and another thing that's bothering me about this fellow, is that he's the only one who's ever met Lucy," added Harry. The doctor said, "Well, I've been thinking about that, and my bet is, that there is no Lord Lucy, and that it's just been him all along." "But what about the photos, the ones I found in my bedroom?" chimed in Lady Penelope. "How do we know that those pictures are all real, and not staged, just placed there for us to find?" Watson replied. "But what about the Debrett's entry?" she continued. "Oh, that's easy to figure. You just pick an uncommon name that's already in the book, obviously not a high profiler, there are dozens of them who nobody has ever heard of, and you call yourself that. Who would know?" "Cunning, hey?" said Harry, as they all turned to stare at me. I confess that I was starting not to like the judge. "But why is he killing us all? It's just so incredible," gasped Lady Penelope. "Well, just look at him. How much of a physiognomist do you have to be? Isn't it obvious?" said Harry, exasperated. Apparently, it was, they all agreed. Somehow, the look they gave me collectively, seemed to sneer, yeah, at me. "Mon Dieu, what are we going to do with him?" asked Hercule. "I vote we lock him in the cupboard where Auntie Jane died," said Lady Penelope. The boys were amazed. The idea seemed to be, what, she thinks as well? "Good idea," said Harry, who seemed to like the idea of banging me up. "I'll go and get my cuffs," said Lady Penelope, and skipped off. I was led upstairs to Lady Jane's room by Hercule and the waving end of Cannon's shooter. Lady Penelope followed us in. "What are these?" asked Cannon, nonplussed. "They're my play cuffs," she smiled. "Oh, and there's this." Cannon took the ball gag, and goggled at Lady Penelope, like a man of the world suddenly realizing that his life had passed him by. Meanwhile, the others were about it and Granny's frocks were all removed from the closet. Then I was roughly pushed in, and forced to stand upon a box. Obviously, I wasn't best pleased with this treatment. But I'd already worked out that some such nonsense might happen, and I'd been half anticipating the blowback. My legs were then cuffed and my arms, which I held above my head, were also cuffed over the empty clothes pole. As usual, I wanted to protest, but I was prevented from doing so by the gag. For a moment my captors stood in a row before me, Harry, Hercule, Cannon, Watson, and Lady Penelope. "Are you okay?" said Lady Penelope smiling at me. The sight of me trussed up may possibly have brought back some happy memory for her. I said. Then the jaws shut and all was darkness. I was in the closet for what seemed like a day, but was in reality only about 40 minutes, before the door suddenly sprang open. My captors stood in a row before me, Hercule, Cannon, Watson, and Lady Penelope. When they had shut the door in my face a short time earlier, they had looked confident that that was that, job done, and had seemed a little giddy with relief. Now they stared at me in disbelief. I think that they were disappointed to discover that I was still actually in the closet. Eventually, Cannon said to me, "Harry has been killed. Why are you not wearing your ball gag?" "It just fell off," I said, not indicating to the object on the floor. "Can I come out now please?" "Sure," said Watson, as if he wasn't really interested. None of them offered to help me down, I noticed. Instead, they all turned away and wandered into the middle of the room. So, I was forced to sort myself out. Lifting the pole above my head and out of its housing, I span it to the vertical, and allowed it to slip between my legs, and onto the floor. Then holding my hands open as far as the chains would allow, I brought them together and back apart rapidly, in a maneuver which would have had David Blaine applauding, and presto, the cuffs were off. Next, taking my wallet from my breast pocket, I located a small key from a pouch, and then removed the leg irons. Finally, I jumped down off the box and stepped out into the bedroom. "There, no harm done," I said, in a jaunty, "we're all friends together" sort of tone, before adding, "Whose turn is it to go in there next?" They all regarded me glumly. Finally, Watson said, "Come on fella. I'll show you Harry. We need to get him moved anyway." We found the old boy on the tennis lawn. He was shot, but only lightly wounded, in the gut, and the shoulder, also in his arm and then his hand, which had some fingers missing. After he'd been shot, they'd put him in a wooden packing case, and filled it up with maggots. Then they buried him, 6 foot under. He was definitely buried alive. Of course, we knew where he was, as soon as we saw that the tennis court had been dug up. As the doctor spoke, we walked. We left Granny's room, tripped downstairs and marched out of the front door. Jumping off the porch, we made our way down to the lower lawn, around the gazebo and along the path next to the promontory. When we arrived at the tennis courts, the scene was exactly as advertised. I could see that the corpse had been taken out of the box, and the maggots dumped out onto the lawn. The maggots were now all busy trying to squirm their way back to their dinner. One detail which the doctor hadn't mentioned, was that the judge was wearing his wig and black cap. Upon closer inspection, I discovered that these props hadn't simply been placed on Harry's head, but had been fixed there using staples. Now, I don't know about you, but if I ever have to staple anything which is more than 3 or 4 sheets of paper thick, then you can guarantee that the staple will fail, by concertinaing itself into something resembling a bug, which you then won't be able to work free, and which will conspire to injure your finger as you try and get it out. So, I could just imagine the fun that you'd have if you were trying to staple something into someone's skull, unless of course, you were firing them in with an air gun. Well, what with my duties as a butler, an undertaker, and a cook, I really didn't have the time to stand around dwelling on such technicalities. We'd had at least 2 deaths so far that morning, and it wasn't even noon. I'd yet to name lunch, although obviously the party had already had a couple of quick potato-based snacks to put them on, roasters and crisps. But, don't get me wrong, I wasn't complaining. I thought perhaps, that having to keep busy, was helping me to keep sane just at that moment. Once dinner was finished and cleared, I was fagged. So, I headed out to the promontory in order to sit alone, and gather my thoughts for 5 minutes. Behind the gazebo, and beyond the lower lawn, there was a headland looking westward over the sea. The clearing contained a single holly oak, with a bench on which you could rest, and where, on a clear day, if your eyesight was up to it, you could watch what the Americans were doing, should you have cared to do so. The spot was pretty familiar to me, due to the amount of hunting around that I'd been forced to do in the past 2 days. Unfortunately, as I entered the clearing, I discovered the corpse of Hercule. Shit. That was exactly what I needed right at that moment, more bother. Upon stepping into the glade, and I might say to my disgust, I could see that Hercule's guts were presently wound around the trunk of the tree. His entrails had been fixed there by a nail. A rope which was suggestively swinging from the bough overhead, had an empty noose in it. Presumably, having been hung, drawn, and then danced around the tree, according to the old prescription, Hercule's remains had then been quartered, into 5 parts, if you see what I mean, the forelimbs, and then his head. There was a bath load of blood, busy soaking into the lawn, and I more or less had to wade through it in order to examine the stiff. As I got closer I could see that Hercule's eyes shone glassy, and he had a queer expression on his face, as if he were about to call the company into the drawing room, and announce who the murderer was. Hey! Voila! What really struck me, was the precise way in which the cuts had been made. I don't know if you've ever chased a slice of bacon around a plate, but if you have, then you'll know that meat isn't really that easy to slice into pieces. However, these cuts were almost surgical, and once again the nagging problem was, how on earth had this been managed? So, as usual, the death bore all the hallmarks of a killer, whose murders were elaborate and improbable, but so well executed. If for one moment, you'd been able to regard the events dispassionately, then you would probably have had to admire the workmanship. I didn't need the doctor to tell me that Hercule was dead, but I went and fetched him anyway, just for the form. We were busy debating about how best to carry off the parts, when Cannon came running up with the gun still in his hand. "Where the hell have you been?" snapped the doctor. Perhaps all the overtime was beginning to take its toll on him. It could also have been a downswing. You could see that Cannon was upset by the doctor's abruptness. He mopped his forehead with a handkerchief the size of a bath towel, and whined, "I was busy working out." "Well, start working out how to help us get this lot downstairs, will you?" said the doctor, waving at the sundry body parts. I confess that I enjoyed listening to Watson pushing the big fatty around. The surviving members of the cast now gathered in the drawing room. There was Cannon, Watson, Lady Penelope, and my alias Parker. We were sat looking at a plate of baked potato with grated ham and cheese, and then at each other. Nobody had much to say. Finally, I got up and told them that I was going to prepare dinner, advising them that, if you don't eat, you don't shit, and if you don't shit you die. The gallows humor wasn't much appreciated. In fact, the outburst was pretty much met with dismay. I was busy in the kitchen making profiteroles, when Watson came and got me. He wanted me to help him find Cannon. Apparently, Cannon had had an idea, and gone off to check something, and hadn't returned. It had been at least 2 hours. He added that Lady Penelope was sedated, and that he didn't want to disturb her. When I spotted a sweaty brown mound on the croquet lawn, I knew that we'd found the fat faggot. He was fixed to the lawn by a loop which had been pushed over his neck. As far as I could tell he was dead, but otherwise there didn't appear to be a whole lot wrong with him. I went and fetched Watson, who snapped into his routine without any fiddle-faddle. "Well, Doc," I asked him finally, anticipating the usual medical horror story. "This one looks like natural causes," he said, winding up his stethoscope. "Natural causes?" I exclaimed. "It can't be," I was amazed. "You're kidding me, right?" The doctor gave me a stern look. The idea seemed to be, "So where did you do your medical studies, Buster?" But he asked me coolly, "Why not?" "Well, what about the other deaths? Natural causes just doesn't fit in with the pattern, with any of what's been going on around here." The doctor eyed me peevishly, and said, "Sorry to spoil it for you, old man. But what you have here," he indicated at the corpse dismissively, "is a man who spent all his life eating lard, but that didn't kill him. He then chose to run around in hot weather, waving a gun at people, and sweating like a rapist, but that didn't kill him either. No, what killed him was his heart. His heart went phut." "But what about his neck being under the croquet ring?" I protested. "Yes," the quack agreed, "that's certainly very strange, mischievous even. But that detail has nothing to do with his death. Could the heart attack have been induced in any way?" Again he conceded, "Yes. I suppose that is just possible, but I can't see any evidence of that. However, what I can see evidence of, and what I shall be putting on the death certificate, is that the fat slob died of a heart attack." In the end, I said grudgingly, "Oh well, you're the one keeping score, I guess." But I wasn't happy. I have to say that I didn't like it one bit. I regarded the ruling like a bad umpiring decision. Yes, it could have happened, but it sure as hell was unlikely, and the coincidence didn't sit at all well with me. Truth to tell, of all the murders, this was the one that I really struggled to come to terms with. In some bizarro way, it seemed the most mysterious. It was certainly the most pointless. Once we'd shifted the body, I scooted along to the drawing room, and there on the table was a tray of Irish potato bites. Without being able to say why exactly, I confess that I felt a lot more settled when I saw them. So, it had come down to this. There was now 3 of us left, Watson, Penelope, and me, Parker. There was a bit of uncertainty about how we should play it now. But following a death, it had become our habit to spend a couple of hours sitting in the drawing room together, and weighing each other up. Finally, I'd had enough, and said, "Well, I'll leave you 2 to it. I'm off to bed. Night." "Good night," they replied cheerfully, but both of them were looking around as if they couldn't work out what was going on, and whether or not I'd pulled a fast one. I hadn't. After I'd commended my soul to keep, I was soon sleeping the sleep of the righteous, and snoring like a bastard. It was in the wee hours when what happened happened. I was busy in the Badlands, playing a game of Destroy All Monsters, when I felt something tugging at my toe. My foot must have been poking out of the bed end. A voice was telling me to wake up for God's sake, won't you? What? I dry-mouthed. As I looked up, I had a vision of something white and ethereal flapping around above me. It was wearing a baby doll, draped over brief white knickers, an uplift bra, and a pair of calf-length white leather booties. Once I'd worked out that I wasn't having another episode, or a wet dream, I started to settle back down. I stared at Milady. "What?" she said, playing the innocent. "A man has his hormones," I said curtly. She shrugged at me as if to say, "Not my problem, bud. Deal with it." I really don't know how you can sleep at a time like this, she said disapprovingly. It's not a problem, baby, I told her. I'm not your baby, and you shouldn't speak to me like that. In my room, in that get-up, at this hour, I raised my eyebrows at her. Forget about my clothes, can't you? She snapped. That's the point, baby, no. I can't. She still wasn't listening, and huffed at me as if it were my fault. I want your help, she demanded. I can see that, I said, looking her over. You're a damsel in distress. Perhaps you want me to take you to Banbury Cross. I don't know what you mean, she snapped. She knew exactly what I meant, all right. Maybe the thought of being next was making her frisky. It occurred to me that she may also have thought that I was behind all these doings, and that she could escape a grisly end by buddying up to me. So, she was just setting out her stall. Honestly, women make you so cynical, and me just a boy. By early next morning, we were in cahoots, if that's what you want to call it, and once it had become light we set out to discover the whereabouts of the focus of all our problems, the evil Watson. We managed to find him all right. He lay in the rotunda, stone dead. He looked like a spat-out piece of chewed meat. It was quite disgusting. I have to say that I was dismayed to find the doctor dead, because I really had thought that it was Watson all along. I always pick a doctor in a whodunit, by the way. I mean, after all, we all know what doctors are: greedy, bungling, megalomaniacs, etc. Still, the evidence was now in. It definitely wasn't Watson. As clever as doctors are, he hadn't eaten himself. So, I was completely wrong, and you won't often hear me saying that. Of course, at this stage in the proceedings, I'd usually go and get Watson to come and do the business. But, Doctor Heal Thyself, was a big ask in the circumstances. I thought it best to have a look and see if I could work out what had happened for myself. I can tell you what I think, although obviously, I'm not a specialist. Well, for a start, I could see that several large bites had been ripped out of the meat of him. In fact, whole chunks were missing. But, I was puzzled. I mean, for heaven's sake, what kind of animal made teeth marks that big? So, what now? Were we looking for a creature resembling a baby dinosaur? And where would you hide such a beast, on an island no bigger than a quarter-mile square? I filed this observation under what I like to refer to as the land the time forgot scenario. You know, the story where you find a hidden entrance to a boy's own underworld, populated by T-Rex and pneumatic fur-clad nubbles. Returning to the body, I could also see that there'd been a few nibbles taken by something with a smaller jaw. What did this indicate? Perhaps we were dealing with a pack of animals, or a mother and child combo, or a monster with two heads. The weirdness didn't end there either, because the body was also covered in what I believe was phosphorus, although I didn't exactly have my periodic table handy. Damned queer, I should say. The most significant thing about this unforeseen eventuality, the death of the doctor, was it meant that there was only two of us left. Lady Penelope and I were the last two. Now, before I start weighing in, can I just say one thing about Lady Penelope? To be perfectly fair to her, nobody ever thought that it was her. I mean, it just couldn't have been her. She was much too fluffy. So logically, you would say that that only left me, right? The point I am making is that I don't blame her for leaping to that conclusion. A false conclusion. As I had been examining Watson's remains, and doing my best with the CSI, I hadn't noticed that Lady Penelope was backing away from me in horror, or spotted that she was busy dropping her bundle. The thing that gave it away to me was that she started a soliloquy, in a hushed psycho voice. I should have known, the butler did it, of course, the butler did it. By the way, just for the record, I'm not a butler. No baby, no not me, I said. If you can detect a slight whine in my voice, then no wonder. I mean, a chap has his feelings. Still, that didn't matter because the girl wasn't listening, as usual. Instead, she had started gulping in huge amounts of air, while repeating over to herself, "It was you, all along, it was you." Let's try that once more, shall we? It was you, all along, it was you. Spooky, hey? Now baby, I tried to mollify her, but she wasn't having any of it. It was you, kept coming right back at me, in her who's to blame ping pong game. Then, just as you thought that it couldn't get any worse, she started wailing at me like Kate Bush trying to reprise her Heathcliff scene. Oh, Jesus. Honestly, I really could have done without that, and it didn't help matters that we were actually outdoors and stood next to a cliff. If you'll allow me to interject here for a minute. I for one just didn't get it. Accepting that the lady believed that I was responsible for this whole clusterfuck, did she really imagine that the best way to deal with the situation would be to start screaming her head off at me like a maniac? But no, she was hysterical. It wasn't me, baby, I tried to tell her above all her bloody racket. Meanwhile, I was looking around for something to stick in her mouth. Still, I kept it friendly. Look, I'm here, staying here on this spot. You're safe. I'm not hurting you. But, I really was talking to a mad woman. After she had vented for a bit, she suddenly stopped and stared at me, as if she absolutely hated me, and had entirely finished bothering about what might happen to her, just as long as she made sure that I got mine. It was all in her eyes. As clear as day. I'm going to get a gun, she spat at me in a black resolve, and turned and stomped her kinky boots off toward the house. Good luck with that, I thought. We'd already searched the house from top to bottom, and there were no guns. Bugger me, if she didn't turn up not 5 minutes later toting an Uzi, which looked to me suspiciously like the weapon that I'd previously been admiring in Smith's attaché case. What the hell was that doing here? It certainly hadn't come with me. Anyway, Uzis are fungible, they will all kill you. So back to more pressing matters. Lady Penelope Stumble rushed towards me and waved the gun in my general direction. Naturally, she was having trouble holding the gun steady in one hand, because of the heft on it. As I say, it was a real baller's gun. Now baby, put that down, there's no need for that, is there? I babbled at her. I'm going to kill you, she said adamantly. She really had made her mind up. In fact, she could have done so at any time, from a way off. I could have told her that, but girls often don't like to be mansplained when they're busy getting busy. Besides, when Lady Penelope was executing the men who had incurred her wrath, she possibly liked to see the whites of our eyes. So, she'd tramped up close enough to spit on me, and was fiddling about with the gun to get it working, preparatory to blowing my silly head off. It was squeaky bum time all right. But baby, I ain't done nothing, I protested. Shut up, she yelled at me, and I took that to be her final word. If I could just get this damned. At that moment a noise, imagine a giant slippery Goliath frog, croaked loudly from somewhere close behind her, and in a panic, she swung around and simultaneously fired several rounds at the lawn, and missed. Shell casings flew everywhere. The gun was automatic. The frog was ventriloquism. Had she been standing properly and holding the gun properly, she would have felt the kick. But, as what she did, in turning in the air, looked like something done with CGI, the force of the salvo was enough to knock her over, and at the same time spill the weapon from her hands. I pounced. Whoops, Butterfingers, I told her. Now, this will surprise you, but getting my hands on the gun did nothing to make life better for my heirs. Clearly, the tables were turned, but that only meant that I was now unequivocally the oppressor. Her newly acquired victim status allowed Lady Penelope to completely vent her resentment and hatred against an unjustified and immoral agent, me. Apparently, I was a very bad man, and she told me so. During this performance, Lady Penelope was on her hands and knees on the grass and moaning up at me. The mascara running down her face made her look like Alice Cooper, and I really don't know where she learned to speak like that, certainly not at Rodin. Possibly, she'd once had a summer job on a trawler. What I found difficult to adjust to, was the mind-boggling change in her behavior. If you remember, a short time earlier, she had been a girl who was happy to run around in her knickers, and who would go into high delight over a game of one potato, and now we had this hellcat to contend with. Still, I was a gentleman about the melodrama. I could see that she was upset, and I tried my best to console her. It's all right, baby. I have the gun now, but I'm not going to hurt you. It's all perfectly fine. You're going to be okay. Look, I am standing here, and the gun is not pointed at you. I hate you, she screamed at me like a gypsy. I could tell that she wasn't in the mood to be conciliatory by the way that she stomped off toward the house. I don't know what she was expecting to find hidden up there this time, a bazooka possibly. Anyway, I had to face facts. It was over between us. As I watched her cute buns bounce behind the laurel maze, I was wondering why everything always had to end so badly, when there was a massive explosion. The smoke signal that it sent up made me suspect that I'd just watched an IED go off. Bye bye baby, bye bye, I told her, although, I like to think that I normally do a bit better with my epitaphs. Seconds later, I was hit by a shower of shit. Chapter 5, Last. I was the only one left. So, I was next. You never really believe that you are next, or you'd simply quit. But trust me, you are. Being alone and next was frankly a thought which made my flesh goose. So, I resolved to clear out immediately. It was the only thing that I could do. I challenge you to think of a better plan. However, for some reason, which was possibly to do with my OCD, I wanted to tidy up before I left. I like to leave a place nice. But after that, I was definitely out of there. I took Watson down to the makeshift morgue first because I knew that the task of scooping up Lady Penelope wasn't going to be so pleasant. It was a messy job, but eventually I managed. I had provided this service to the others, and I felt that I owed it to these last two. Now, I've read enough trashy novels in my time to know the gimmick where one of the murdered people is not actually dead, or where a body is switched and then disfigured. So, I wasn't going to be falling for any of those crummy routines. In fact, I spent some time in the dead room looking into the eyes of all the corpses and checking their pulses. One thing that the damned papers picked up on was that each of the bodies had a post-mortem mark where they had been burned. That was me. I was checking that they were all actually dead with my lighter. But there was nothing doing, and just as I was finishing with this morbid task, a disembodied voice said, "Nope, they're all dead, boyo." I started, I can tell you, I nearly turned myself inside out, before I realized that I'd begun talking to myself, in Welsh. That was it. I was talking in tongues, but the Welsh was the final straw. At least I had enough good sense to recognize that I was rapidly becoming unhinged. That I was practically raving. It would be prophecy next, the way things were going. Still, in my defense, I must say that I was stranded on an island, with 10 stiffs. Plus, it was pretty creepy being down there in the cellar amongst the Chateau Neuf der Pape and the assorted cadavers. Alone on an island, with all those dead bodies, have a think about it. Well, I had a good think, and it still made no sense to me. However, one thing that did occur to me concerned the record that we'd been asked to listen to on that first evening, before it had all kicked off. Looking back, I'd rather been expecting to learn something from the recording that would help in some way to make sense of the subsequent events. Then, it suddenly hit me, that a record has two sides, and I admitted, duffer that I am, it seemed entirely likely that I'd gone and played the wrong side. So, I hurried upstairs to the drawing room where the record was still sat on the turntable exactly as I had left it. I lifted it up, span it over, and the music soon started. It was Dave Brubeck's Take 5. Pat returned on Thursday morning at 11 o'clock. So, he was right on time. As I minced down the steps to meet him, I said conversationally, "Lord Lucy wants to speak to you, he would like you to go up to the house." I could immediately see in Pat's face that he expected the interruption to eat into his drinking time, so I told him, "He only needs you for 5 minutes, don't worry, I'll finish unloading these for you." "Walk to the house, or unload a boat, please press the red button now." Pat smiled at me and I gave him a gift. "Here, take these, the veal cutlets and mint imperials, they want them up there right away." As the captain disappeared up the steps, I took possession of his boat, and with a chorus of Bobby Shafto, I shoved off for the mainland and home. Chapter 6, Home. You know, in a strange way, I was pleased to get home, back into the big house. For a moment, I stood outside to study the high, gray, imperious walls, and consider the sign next to the door in the gate, which read, Parkwood Scrubs Prison. As I dawdled into reception, I was accosted by one of the trolls who was busy guarding the dark tower. "Oh, hello, Doctor. There's been some talk about you. You're a bit late back, and they were considering getting the dogs G'd up. As you know, the governor is very particular about punctuality." "Yes, thank you, Mr. Stickler. I'll try and bear that in mind in future." Mr. Green was a lot more civilized about it, and that really is all I ask for, you know. After surrendering in my bits and pieces, and signing a few things for them, I was briskly escorted back to my cell. As they locked the door behind me, I stood and looked at my cellie. I'll be honest, this was the moment that I had been dreading. Still, I knew that I was going to have to tell him. "Hello, Name, it's bad news, I'm afraid. There's been a mass killing." Name said nothing. His expression meanwhile said, "Fuck me, what another?" "Listen, Name, you're the expert, is there any way that you could just up and murder 10 people somehow, without actually knowing it?" "Like what, in your sleep?" he replied slightly contemptuously. I was pleased to discover that in my absence Name had cheesed the annoying habit of calling everyone master, and I could see that my question had been a bit of a misstep. However, this tone could not be allowed to continue. What we had on here was a respect issue. So I sauntered over to him, and grabbing his forearm, I gave him an Indian burn. "Guess who's back?" I told him maliciously, as he screamed at me to stop. But no guards came running. After Coco, we were both in our cots, and it was just like old times. It was as if I'd never been away. Having had a belly full of stodge, I was feeling expansive, and not having a lot on at that particular time, I began to tell the prisoner's favorite tale, or, where we went wrong the last time. I began in the time-honored manner, the once upon a time of prison chat. "It's probably best that I don't tell you this, Name, but I know that you wouldn't tell anyone. You know that you'll be covered by client confidentiality, besides who the hell am I going to tell?" he responded. I considered this. Name, or more correctly Professor Name, was a disbarred psychiatrist, who had gotten away with it, by convincing the proper authorities that he was frickin' nuts. he was now grinning at me in a way that was intended to suggest that his behavior was all part of a carefully crafted master plan, but which in reality just made him look even more screwy. Still, I figured that he could be trusted. So I went on the horizontal and let him have it. I emptied the bag for him. When I'd done, Name took off the portholes which had steamed up, and looked at me meaningly and myopically. "So, what do you think, Doc?" I asked him. Name made a tent with his fingers and a moo with his lips. "Why would anyone bother to murder them one at a time? Why not just get them all there, lock and load, and bam bam bam?" I pressed him. "Unless you wanted to enjoy doing it, offing them. Say like eating chocolates from a box." I realized that what Name meant was sadism. But it was a shitty analogy and he knew it. "Is offing them the sort of terminology that a consulting psychoanalyst should be choosing to employ?" I asked the medic rather starchily. Name apologized, adding that it was his environment which was causing him to let his standards slip. And why was I the only one left? Why was I not killed, was what I wanted to know. "Well, because..." I eyed the professor warily. We both knew that he had arrived at a point where he needed to tread very carefully. It was what the logicians like to call the prisoner's dilemma. "Briefly, you're a former Harley Street psychiatrist, who finds himself banged up in a prison cell with a man whom you suspect of being a multiple mass murderer. You've sworn yourself to the Hippocratic Oath. Do you call him out on it, oi, matey? Because of respect. The killer respected you. Perhaps, he also feared you a little." I stared at Name. I for one wasn't going to be paying him 20 guineas an hour, to be listening to that sort of drivel, and in a short period of time I would be telling him so. I think that I managed to communicate something of this to the doctor, who hastily started to recalibrate his position. Perhaps the memory of the Indian burn was still fresh in his mind and sore on his arm. "And remember, you shouldn't have been there. You actually hadn't been invited. Perhaps that was why the murderer left you alone, because he knew that you weren't Smith." Now this was more like it. This was what I like to call a point of contention, or at least something that you could trot out for the benefit of the jury. But what I really want to know, is how was it all done? Were there people coming on and off the island? Say frogmen swimming ashore at night, from a vessel parked up beneath the briny? You see, that's just so much baloney, but nothing else I can come up with makes any sense. It's all just so unlikely. "What do the police think?" asked Name, optimistically switching the responsibility of doing the brain work onto the police. "Nothing. They've arrested the ferryman and they're going to stick it on him. As we speak the Garda is probably busy rubber hosing Patrick O'Blarney Stone, while he's telling them the tale of the strange Tanaist who came over on the boat, and who's now disappeared off into the House of Donn. Poor old Pat will be getting it in the neck, simply because he was the Johnny on the spot, and even in an Irish detective story, which is what this really is by the way, the simplest explanations are the best. Seems a bit unfair." I looked at Name carefully to see if there was any hint of his meaning, my not getting the credit for all the sterling work, but I left it. Instead, I asked him, "We were in Ireland, but I assume that you're entirely dismissing a supernatural explanation of events." "Ultimately, there are only supernatural explanations," the quack conceded rather fretfully. "Are you worried that they'll be able to trace it all back to you somehow?" "Unlikely. Not without fingerprints. Let's for one moment say that it really was me, then it's more or less the perfect crime, killing someone whilst you're in prison. Any tracking they try comes up against a stone wall, unless they really look into it. Not in your case. They know your record, and they know that you can walk out of here any time that you want, with or without a day pass." "Yes, the grown-ups do, but not Plod," I mused. "What you need to remember is, that although the civilian police are well motivated by the prospect of doing folk a bit of no good, at bottom, they're still feckless civil servants. Anything that involves them in the slightest bit of organization or effort, and they're flummoxed. Plus, you've got the hole over the garden wall thing going on, between the Garda and His Majesty's Constabulary. After a good deal of staring blankly out into the middle distance, Name said quietly, "The heap isn't going to be best pleased." I looked at him. I had the death stare on. So, that was Name's idea, was it, that the heap was involved? I wondered. Was it possible that this was an MI6 show? Could it have been a put-up job, all along? Had the incorrigible Heap arranged this by sicking me onto the Smith case? Had the Name been Heap's inside man, helping him to direct the traffic? I thought for a moment about how conveniently the dates for my week out had appeared out of the blue and how masterfully the car had been parked, the lure of the limo. Certainly, the Heap was the maestro when it came to pressing folks' buttons. I also considered the familiar manila folder, with its top-secret instructions, and was reminded of how much the arch-administrator, Heap, loved a manila folder. But, was he so au fait with the complex Thomas Pike persona, that he'd been able to work out what the outcome would be, if he holed me up for a short period of time, in a bog, with a gang of thieves and traitors? It stretched my credulity to believe such subtlety, even of the vulturous Heap, but I couldn't exactly discount it either. "Fuck Heap," I said hostilely, before indulging myself in a little reverie, in which I played football with the Heap's dumb head. He shoots, he scores. Then, I chided myself for getting so upset by the thought of the master puppeteer, and all his black arts. Finally, I lay on the cot, placed my head gently on the pillow, and thought about all the deaths. There'd been a lot of death all right, and it just didn't seem to make any sense, whatsoever. The end. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that's my story, and I'm damn well sticking to it. I hope the jury likes it. All I ask of them, is that they should have a good think about what I've told you here, and so go into the House of Donn for themselves. That way everything will become perfectly clear to them. Try it. Chin chin.